The following video on Ico contains spoilers for the entire game. If you haven't played Ico, then I highly recommend you do so before watching any further. Ico was released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. The initial release sold fairly poorly, but it gained critical acclaim and status as a cult title, with many only discovering the game long after it came out. Its status grew to the point where it saw a re-release in Europe in 2006 to coincide with Shadow of the Colossus, and a HD remake in 2011 for the PlayStation 3. The game starts with a very well-directed and restrained cutscene introduction. Throughout the whole game there's only 5 or 6 main cutscenes dedicated to moving the story along, and they're generally very brief. This almost wordless introduction to the game is by far its longest scene and is used mostly to establish the atmosphere. In a sense, the star of the opening isn't Ico, the young boy protagonist, but rather the castle itself. The majority of the shots in the opening cutscene are placed far away from Ico. This gives a strong impression of the castle with its vast amounts of empty space. Even once the game starts, the very first moment of gameplay sees Ico framed by a large barren room, and many of the camera angles throughout the game continue this trend. This allows the game to freely and naturally swap between two distinct atmospheres. Excessively spacious interiors come off as oppressively large, whereas large outdoor areas feel more relaxing. This is punctuated by the sound effects as well. Ambient Noise outdoors consists of wind and singing birds. Indoors consists almost solely of Ico's echoing footsteps and the crackle of flames, sometimes accompanied by duller wind effects which sound more ominous. The majority of the save points are located outdoors, as these are the most relaxing places the game has to offer. By contrast, the indoor areas often seem less welcoming. Essential to maintaining this atmosphere is the lack of a heads-up display. It's clear the team wanted players to be as immersed in the game as possible. Even the introductory rooms lack any sort of button prompts on screen or any modern tutorial elements. It's likely Fumito Ueda, the game's director, was aware that this would cause some people frustration, but valued the aesthetics of the game too much to impose text over it. The only time this concession is made is with the save points. Even at its most complex, the game only requires a few button presses, but the introduction is particularly light, with the first 2 rooms introducing switches and chains individually. There's also no pressure on the player at this point. Since Yorda hasn't been freed yet, the shadows have no reason to appear. By the time the player reaches Yorda, they've already used about half of Ico's entire moveset. A health bar and a few numbers on screen is generally a small price to pay for the information that provides, and most players will build up a mental filter where that information is disregarded until it becomes relevant in some way. That said, there's no denying that Ico's uncluttered frame is more aesthetically pleasing than it would be otherwise. This wasn't an innovation though, rather it was inspired by Another World, a cinematic platformer which released about a decade before Ico. As games developed more mechanics, and particularly as they moved into the 3-dimensional realm, it became more difficult for designers to remove the heads-up display entirely. For example, if a character has a certain amount of health that can be depleted before they die, then a health bar is a fairly natural way to represent that information. Ico, on the other hand, has just 2 states, alive and dead. Again, this mirrors cinematic platformer conventions where death was usually instantaneous. Relatively realistic animations and limitations on the character's movement were another staple of cinematic platformers, and this carries over into Ico as well. Most people label Ico as an action-adventure title, and that's not a bad genre to place it in. However, I'd say it's actually a cinematic platformer. It just happens to be 3D, unlike its predecessors. Once Yorda is out of her cage, the true game begins. This is where one of the cleverest aspects of Ico comes into focus, the way the languages work. You could be forgiven for thinking that Ico speaks Japanese. He is voiced by a Japanese actor, and it bears some similarities to that language, but in fact his speech is entirely fabricated, and the same goes for Yorda. Her obscured subtitles tell us simply and immediately that a language barrier separates the two of them. The decision to handle the languages this way is very clever, so I want to take some time to highlight the many benefits. First of all, the voice acting is practically guaranteed not to sound terrible. It's much harder to identify flaws in an actor's delivery when they're speaking a language you don't understand. As long as the overall tone of the characters is right, then the dialogue will be as powerful as it needs to be. Secondly, the voiceovers don't need to be localized for different areas. This cuts down on the amount of work for localization teams, means people overseas get the game faster, and ensures everyone gets the same quality of voice acting. Thirdly, the lip syncing will always match the audio. In some rare cases, the lip syncing will be redone for a foreign language dub, but most of the time this isn't the case. Usually the localization team will make some effort to not only translate the meaning of the script into a new language, but also preserve some semblance of lip syncing in the words. This is a tough balancing act. In Ico, the teams never had to struggle with this. Fourthly, a foreign language reinforces the mysterious atmosphere of the setting. Even inside the game itself, Yorda is foreign to Ico, which makes her especially mysterious to both him and us. And finally, the most important point, it's likely the team never intended for the player to be capable of giving Yorda any complex commands. If Yorda and Ico spoke the same language, then this would be more frustrating for the player, as they might wonder at times why Ico wouldn't just ask Yorda to perform certain actions. With no dialogue to strengthen the bond between the characters, the game relies on other methods. One good example happens very shortly after Ico meets Yorda. As they walk across a bridge, it crumbles, leaving Yorda in a dangerous position. A near miss like this helps the player form an attachment to her. It also introduces the way Yorda will need a hand up ledges sometimes and prevents the player from going backwards. If there's anything this game excels at, it's accomplishing a lot with very little. Minimalism sits at the heart of Ico, with the director stating that his goal was design by subtraction. This was born from a desire to create something against the grain of games at the time, which seemed to be piling on more and more bells and whistles. Part of the beauty of Ico is that everything about it seems obvious. It seems obvious to have Ico lead Yorda around by holding her hand. It seems obvious for the two to relax together while the game is being saved. It seems obvious that the player should be able to pull her out of holes in the ground in order to save her. To say this is all obvious undersells Ico though. In its movement, save points and combat, the game has subtly integrated Yorda in small but meaningful ways. It's telling that the animations play such a central role in the relationship between Yorda and Ico. Animation was a particular area of interest for Ueda growing up, and he got his start in the industry as an animator. None of the movements were created using any form of motion capture, they were all animated by hand. It's hard to say how much this adds to the game, however. Most of the animations which benefit from having been done by hand probably would have been done manually anyway, even if others had been motion captured. It does, however, highlight Ueda's commitment to his artistic vision. Ueda took on so many roles it gives the impression he would have created the entire game by himself had he been capable of it. He served as the director, lead designer, lead animator and art director, as well as hand-painting the iconic box art. Evidently, he was far from the only team member giving it his all. The technical team would have put more effort into the animation system than most teams at the time, because Ico was one of the earliest games to use inverse kinematics. This allows a character's feet to land in the correct place on uneven terrain and adjust the leg accordingly. It's something taken for granted in most modern games, but given the limited hardware and expertise about such systems at the time, it would have been a much larger challenge. This can be seen most clearly when Ico and Yorda climb stairs. Bloom lighting was another technology pioneered by Ico, and this went on to become one of the principal aesthetic qualities of the outdoor scenes. The characters' clothes and hair also have some simple cloth dynamics to them as well, instead of being predetermined animations. The wind in the outdoor scenes isn't just heard, it's felt as well, and it becomes stronger in more exposed areas. Initially, the game started development on the PlayStation 1 and eventually moved over to the PlayStation 2 after the team had difficulty getting the artificial intelligence working within the memory constraints of the former system. These things all show a willingness to embrace new technology rather than shun it. Despite its simplistic visuals and quaint charm, Ico is technically quite an impressive feat of science as well as art, at least for its time. This isn't to say there's no room for improvement, however. The transitional scenes between areas which act as brief load times were probably a concession which had to be made rather than an intentional design choice. Although it may be technically segmented into many different sections, it's noteworthy that the whole game takes place in a single, tightly designed location. A crumbling castle, where the deterioration of the environment is used as an obstacle, is hardly the most original setting for a game, but Ico carries it very well. This is especially true for the two arena structures in the middle of the game, which are symmetrically designed. In the first building, the player becomes acquainted with the layout and their goal of making it to the top. The biggest speed bump here is some questionably placed invisible platforms at the summit, which probably should have been introduced at an earlier juncture. The player has to make quite a leap in logic and drag Yorda all the way up to the top to discover them. However, after overcoming this first challenge, the brilliance lies in the second building, which has some very minor differences compared to the first. This results in a subtly more difficult experience the second time around, which the player can feel confident in tackling because the objectives are the same. The areas have been designed to make use of a very limited number of gameplay elements. Ico is cobbled together by a combination of ladders, levers, chains, ropes, sticks, swords, boxes, and the occasional bomb. All of these items are very grounded in reality, which makes the ostensibly surreal castle oddly more realistic than the environments of many other games. The team were also careful not to include any invisible walls anywhere. In the end, the player's path through the castle is quite linear, but the absence of immersion-breaking roadblocks makes it feel more open and inviting than many of its contemporaries. Even when the game branches out from its regular gameplay elements, it does so with care not to disrupt the setting. The windmill section is a good example. It represents a unique traversal challenge for the player, but matches the environment perfectly. Perhaps the greatest accomplishment of the level design in Ico is how natural it feels. The gameplay elements all work in a very obvious and consistent manner, and at no point does the game ever outright tell the player the next objective. Instead, that objective is made clear by the smooth level design and heavily scripted camera. The default camera angles offer a compromise between guiding the player and providing visually appealing angles on the action which make the game look more picturesque. The price paid for this are some unwieldy camera controls if the player attempts to adjust the viewpoint manually. This requires a certain level of trust on the player's behalf that the camera will show them all the information they need, which is usually the case. For a game with a limited amount of space such as Ico, this solution seems time-consuming but ultimately worthwhile. That said, since the camera is scripted by a person, it can be prone to errors it might not otherwise suffer. A couple of points see it transition poorly right before a critical jump or narrow walkway, which at worst can result in death. Aside from accomplishing their obvious gameplay objectives, the environments in Ico are set up to present certain tones at certain times. This is distinct from giving the castle a history. In fact, most areas are left deliberately barren, leaving players unsure of what their initial purpose was. Yorda's absurdly high birdcage, for example, is never explained, but it evokes the ominous feeling it's supposed to, and lingers in memory long after the action moves on from it. It's the looming threat of what will happen to her if they fail to escape. Once the characters are separated, the design shifts towards duller tones, rainy weather, and areas filled with metal rather than stone, until Ico re-enters the castle. This is a reversal from earlier where the outdoor scenes looked more pleasant, most likely designed this way to match Ico's mindset at the time. His goal is to get back into the castle, so the castle becomes a more inviting place to the player in order to put them in Ico's position. With a talented team and strict focus on the core design, Ico hits close to perfection, at least at what it sets out to do. Even so, there are elements of it which will strike the wrong chord with some, with a common and not unfounded complaint being the simplistic combat. This comes back to the relentless focus on Yorda. In a conventional game outline, the combat might be the focus, with Yorda merely existing as a failure state to punish a player's incompetent play. In Ico, this priority is reversed. Yorda was created first, and combat was created merely as a way to give the two characters another meaningful interaction. Does this forgive the repetitive combat sections scattered throughout? Ultimately, that's up to each player to decide. Ico is not a skill-intensive game. The number of deaths in any given playthrough can vary widely, of course, but this number is likely to be lower than if that player had chosen a more conventional game instead. This comes across as intentional design, another way to keep the player as immersed as possible. Games are unique in the way they ask players to disregard certain aspects of their story as soon as they die. We rewrite the story in our minds so that instead of Ico having died 10 or 15 times over, he survived all the way to the end. That's the only version of events. Just like the heads up display from before, there's a filter that exists which requires maintaining on our part. And just like before, the experience is stronger the less we have to maintain that filter. Ueda took this approach to immersion to extremes with the sound design as well. Music is notably absent from the majority of the game because this puts the player more accurately into the environment. Outside of cutscenes, music is only heard to signify a few events and during combat. Even then, the combat track is very understated. It's only later, during the game's darkest scene, that the music plays a larger part. This penultimate fight, where Ico combats the shadows that have plagued the two for the entire game, is powerful because so many different aspects come together, the haunting music track being one of them. It stands out tonally from any other music played up until this point. Initially, Ico was given horns just to distinguish him as the protagonist of the game, but the horns come into play here where it's made clear that the shadows are actually the children who were previously sacrificed. The design of the shadows in particular is brilliant in its simplicity. Even though their shape has changed in this final confrontation, they're obviously recognisable as the same enemies from before. Earlier in the game, they take on more monstrous forms, which makes their status as enemies completely unambiguous, but perhaps more importantly, it helps to mask the fact that they all have horns similar to Ico. With the changed designs, their status as evil beings comes into question and their horns come into focus. It's the character designs and environment which tell the story in this room rather than any dialogue, and the extended length of the fight gives plenty of time for the implications here to sink in and impact the player. This complicates the previously very simplistic story of Ico, especially in the way it contextualizes the Shadow's protectiveness of Yorda throughout the game. It's worth noting that none of them will ever harm her. Ultimately, this is the first step on the path to Ico's ambiguous ending. Although it seems on the surface to be a climactic moment of conflict, in reality the player is in no danger at all when fighting the Shadows here. This is just another way in which Ico shuns game design conventions. It's all the more strange then that the final event inside the castle is a very traditional final boss situation. Although it's treated more like a puzzle than a skilled combat sequence, there's a very real danger of Ico dying, and the ultimate goal is to kill the Queen. It's interesting that a game which went against the norms of almost every other game at the time still opted to include a boss fight at its conclusion. It feels surprisingly at place within an otherwise restrained game and brings the story a sense of closure it would have lacked otherwise. Many champion Ico as a prime example of a game which is also a work of art, with some even saying it marks the moment where games started to embrace artistic qualities on par with other mediums. The truth, however, is that Ico is no more or less a work of art than Another World was 10 years before it. It's arguable which one is better, of course, but that's besides the point. They share so many similarities that calling one a work of art while dismissing the other would be ridiculous. Ueda didn't set out specifically to create a work of art because computer games are already inherently a form of art. Many game designers cite Ico as one of their favourite games, and if a lot of people gravitate towards something, inevitably some of them will misunderstand it, at least on some level. Sometimes it seems like the impression Ico has left on game designers is that subverting expectations or eschewing common design sensibilities automatically brings a game closer to being a piece of art. Ueda, however, understood when to use conventional elements such as a final boss fight to his advantage. The ending cutscene is another great example of this. While the majority of Ico shows how games can be powerful when they get out of the player's way and simply allow them to experience the world naturally, the ending cutscene is powerful precisely because the player is no longer in control. After protecting Yorda for the entire game, it's now our turn to helplessly rely on her for a change. It's here that the relationship at the core of the game truly becomes reciprocal. If there's a lesson to take from Ico, it must be its utterly unrelenting focus and commitment to a single artistic goal. Its simplicity and purity can often mask the fact that Ico is one of the most focused game experiences of its era, with almost every element of its design contributing to immersing the player in Ico's role and fostering a relationship with Yorda. Despite the fact that it was intentionally designed not to be like other games at the time, Ico embraced computer games as a medium for storytelling better than most have ever managed to. The characters aren't complex, the plot isn't deep. Taking Ico exactly the way it is now and making it as a film or a book simply wouldn't have the same impact. In adapting the work, it would have to change significantly to maintain a reader or viewer's interest, a point which was proven by a novelization of Ico which released after the game. Its quality as a book is debatable, but it relies so much on backstory and other details to flesh out its plot that it ceases to be Ico as we know it. It's an experience which can't be replicated as effectively by any other method than controlling Ico himself. If Ico really is a three-dimensional cinematic platformer, then why isn't it labelled as such? Really, that has more to do with what happened after the game's release. For a game so embedded in the hearts and minds of designers everywhere, it's notable that Ico never spawned any significant imitators. Nobody wanted to challenge what Ueda and his team had achieved over those 4 arduous years of development, and why would they? After all, it's hard to think of a concept more simple or effective than a boy and a girl holding hands.